Okay, hello, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Before we get started on today's webinar about coronavirus and climate change, I just wanted to take a moment to send our thoughts and best wishes to those who are affected by the virus or those who have family who are affected. This is a virus that affects everyone, and now is an important time to show compassion and empathy towards each other and come together in sort of a virtual way and to make sure that we support each other. So, my name is Dr. Reuben Sussman. I run the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. We're one of the co-conveners of BECC, and I'm here with Maxine Chicumbo, virtually, of course, and together we'll be running today's webinar. I also wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the BECC conference. Without these sponsors, the conference and the webinars would not happen. If you are at an organization or you're interested in sponsoring, just let us know and we can throw you into the next slide. And of course, I wanted to mention that this year's BECC conference is happening in December here in Washington, D.C., and we're still accepting submissions until May 8th. The conference is planned to go ahead as before, but of course, we're keeping an eye on things as they change with the coronavirus, and we'll be flexible as needed. So head on over to beccconference.org to submit an abstract if that's something you're interested in. And of course, we have these webinars monthly. The next one is in May, and you can register today at beccconference.org. It'll be on behavioral science and how we can use that to maximize the impact of energy affordability assistance programs. Those are utility-run programs for low-income residents. Okay, so few logistics. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode, but you will have time for questions after the presentation. Sometimes the questions are the best part. So please send us questions using the chat box at any time, and Maxine will read the questions during our question period at the end. This webinar is being recorded, so you don't need to furiously write everything down. We'll send you a link after the webinar is done. So today's topic is climate change in the time of coronavirus. And we're very excited. We have 275 people online right now listening, and it seems like more people are still rolling in. Beth Carlin at the Sea Change Institute put today's webinar together, and we have 3 incredible speakers to join her. So I'm going to turn it over now to Beth. Beth, welcome.
Hi there. Welcome, everyone.
Beth, I'm making you the presenter now.
Awesome. All right. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm really excited about this webinar. And I want to open with an invocation, if you will. I was thinking about what to call this, and an invocation is an appeal to a higher authority to ask for help. And I believe that this community and the speakers that we've assembled and all of us that are here are that higher authority. So in preparing and thinking through this webinar, I thought about what's going on right now. What can I do? What can we all do? And thinking about what's next, that I do believe that we need to be making a home for what doesn't have a home yet. We are what's next. We have the opportunity to prepare for the future, to create the future. And the goal of this webinar is to do that, is to begin a conversation within this community, the behavior, energy, and climate change community, for what COVID means now and what it can mean. So we're going to hear from a few speakers. I'll introduce all of them. We'll each speak for about 10 minutes. Then we'll turn over at the end to discussion. And again, we want to figure out, and feel free, we won't get to every question, but put them in there because we'll receive them all. And we do intend for this to be a start. The organizers will be reviewing everything that you share and getting back to people and thinking about what the behavior, energy, climate change community, historically a physical conference, has been and can be, so that we can make a home for what doesn't have a home yet. Think about what's coming. So our speakers are going to talk about COVID impacts, right? There's been a lot in the news about climate impacts. That's a topic that will come up. What is going on? What are the current impacts? What have we already seen? COVID lessons. This is one of my favorite memes that has come around, right? Like, what can we learn? How can we take this as an opportunity to do better? at whatever it was that we were working on. And then opportunities. How can we act? How can we respectfully take this and make the most out of this tragedy so that we can prevent the next one and the next one and the next one. So I'm going to be introducing our other speakers. First up, we have Chris Jones. Truly, Chris has been all over the news, one of the leading folks talking to journalists and informing the public on what's going on. Chris's public profile around this was what gave us as a BECC organizing committee the idea. And while I'm doing this, Ruben and Chris, you can do all the slide moving stuff. Has been one of the main people and an organizer of BECC forever for as long as I've been involved, which goes back about a decade. Chris is the director of the Cool Climate Network at UC Berkeley. He led the development of the first carbon footprint calculators to account for GHG emissions in all of transportation, energy, food, goods, and services. He is in his there we go 11th year as program chair of the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. He's also an incredible human being and somebody who when things like this happen, want to talk to and hear from. So I'm excited that he gets to share some thoughts with all of us. So Chris, are you set up screen sharing yet? You ready to go? We see Chris.
Chris, please unmute yourself.
Isn't technology fun, kids?
Okay, Chris, I'm going to take control, and I'll show your slide on my screen here. Okay. Chris, please unmute yourself. I'll unmute you. It says you've self-muted, so I can't unmute you. Okay, Chris. Let's go on to the next presenter.
All right, and I was muted. All right, we'll try and move on and come back. We did tech check this. It's funny how something can work 10 minutes and 10 minutes later not work. Thank you for bearing with us. If you have gotten through as 3 to 4 weeks at home and have not had a technical issue, please email me. I want to talk to you. You're a unicorn. So thank you everyone for bearing with us as we are.
So the next is Gernot.
Yep. So as we're navigating, thank you so much for bearing with us. So now we're going to turn over to Gernot Wagner. Gernot is an associate professor at NYU's Department of Environmental Studies and an associated clinical professor at the Wagner School of Public Service. Prior to joining NYU, Gernot was the founding executive director of Harvard's Solo Geoengineering Research Program, a research associate at the Harvard John A. Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and a lecturer on environmental science and policy at Harvard. He's co-author of the book Climate Shock, which I highly recommend everyone check out if you haven't. And like is a lot. I think Time Magazine, the New York Times has been really doing a lot of public discourse around this issue. So thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Beth. Yeah, climate change and COVID have a bazillion links. I guess the primary one, and the one that, I guess the one tweet that went viral almost immediately, is COVID is climate change on warp speed, right? So we all know the exponential growth for climate change. That's the driving force, right? It is not about levels. It's not about the 1 degree centigrade of warming so far. It's about where we are heading, right? And frankly, I have failed over the last decade, 2 decades by now, to communicate that on climate, right? It's not about what we know. It's about what we don't know, and so on and so forth. Well, COVID just changed that, right? We forget our sort of politics for a moment. Let's go to a semi-rational leader, Macron in France, for example. On a Friday night, he was seen going to the theater, demonstrating normalcy, right, encouraging everyone to go out. On Sunday, he was strolling with his wife, going shopping, encouraging others to do that. Tuesday, 3 days later, his culture minister contracted COVID. And by Thursday, that exact same week, 6 days after his visit to the theater, France was shut down, right? That's what 33% exponential daily growth does. So what happens with climate over decades and centuries, here happened over days and weeks. And still, we got things wrong, right? We couldn't anticipate on a Friday what would happen within a week. Now, we've all seen graphs like this, right? Flatten the curve. Well, there too is a climate analogy, of course, right? For COVID, it is flattening the curve. For climate, it's bending the curve, bending the trajectory of emissions, making sure that we don't just look at emissions directly today, but their path going forward. In many ways, the path matters a lot more than today's levels. Now, one thing actually I saw on Chris's first slide before, and Beth addressed this too, of course, right? The immediate climate impact of COVID. Here's some of my own doodlings on this. One of the main points to make here is that COVID is simply not what climate action looks like, right? We know the trajectory of emissions, right? Going up, up, and up. Well, highly scientific graph, somewhere by 2050, plus minus a couple decades, we know we need to get down to zero, right? What is that? That's approximately 6% per year. What happened this year due to COVID, or what is projected to happen this year? Something akin to a 3% decrease in emissions in 2020. So in order to decrease emissions, like science tells us we need to do twice as much as what we currently did. And no, COVID is not the template in what ought to happen, right? This is not about going back to our caves. This is about more action, more investment, more activity in order to turn this curve around. Frankly, I can now tell two stories going two directions, saying the exact opposite thing. We simply don't know where things go at this point, right? So flights just stopped almost completely. The sales meeting in Cleveland got canceled this year. Well, one story would be emphasizing the behavioral aspects here. This year's sales meeting got canceled. We saved a bit of money. Next year, it's Barcelona or bust, or Bali or bust, right? Why not do it for real? We couldn't travel anywhere this summer. Let's go even further next year. So one behavioral angle here to take is to say, well, actually, COVID was a clear step backwards, because really what it showed us was behavioral change alone just can't do it. We'll bounce back and do more of what we would have done otherwise. Emissions will increase, not decrease, as a result of COVID. Now, here's the other story. Right, so this very week, for the very first time, IPCC lead authors are meeting virtually. It's always been an in-person meeting. It was supposed to be an in-person meeting this week, 200 people flying halfway around the world. to talk climate science. Well, this year, it's happening, or this week, it is happening over Zoom, virtually. Of course, this is not unique to IPCC. The high energy physicists have been doing this for a decade. Right? There's a couple of thousand of them involved in the CERN project in Switzerland. They've been holding web meetings forever, trying to avoid long distance trips for very, very short meetings. It works. It's possible. Of course, what it should tell us is that really it is all about institutions. It is all about policy, government, to decide, well, from here on, we shall in fact take certain steps that we hadn't done before. The current situation, right? I have my two kids right here next to me, playing Lego on the floor. No, that's clearly not the situation we want to be in. On the other hand, yeah, there are certainly lots and lots of changes that are possible, that frankly can, and as we know, must go well beyond the kinds of changes we have seen so far this year over the course of the past few weeks. What it takes in my book, quite literally, actually, is it takes policy. Right? It takes us to figure out how to guide the actions of many, many of us, much more so than even COVID did on the individual behavioral level. And of course, right, we've all seen the pictures of the Florida beach, right? In one county, the beach is clear, empty. In the other county, you see spring breakers on the beach. It takes policy. It takes policy at the county level. It takes policy at the city level here in New York City, at the state level, and of course, ideally also on the federal level and above.
Yeah, I was going to ask her to send me a new meeting ID.
And with this, I think Chris is ready to talk. So maybe this is the time to hand it over to him.
No, let's. Why don't you finish your talk, and then we'll switch over to Chris right after.
Okay, so maybe just one last point, right? So it's actually the latest I wrote on climate and COVID just earlier today for my Bloomberg column. There's so many parallels, it's hard to choose. But here's one idea: carbon taxes, which we all know economists love or love to hate, and in many ways is right, the first best answer that many of us try to shout from the rooftops, tweet from the rooftops. Well, turns out it may well be very much like what 100% COVID testing is on the COVID side, right? So there's this ideal answer. We all know it's necessary. There's lots of us economists who now pretend to be epidemiologists, at least on Twitter, who have proposed this as the only way out. Right? There are op-eds in the Wall Street Journal by esteemed economists talking about, of course we know we need testing. There is no way around this. Iceland is doing it, or at least attempting to test all 370,000 of its people. Why shouldn't the US scale up testing dramatically? Test early, test often, and so on and so forth. The only way out, or for that matter, the cheapest way out, the most efficient way out. Well, here's the climate analogy, right? The first best answer to what to the problem we have of internalizing the externality, to use the dirty economic term, of course, is to price the negative externality. Of course, the first best policy is to tax carbon or price carbon via all sorts of other means, right? Policy, policy, policy. Well, it doesn't take long to figure out that that first best answer in the real world is not, in fact, the only, or for that matter, best answer. It takes much, much more. It takes subsidies. It takes direct interventions. It takes lots and lots of other things we ought to be doing to turn the climate ship around. Well, COVID, the same thing, right? Testing, wouldn't it be nice if we were able to scale things up dramatically. Meanwhile, there are lots and lots of stumbling blocks, and frankly, lots and lots of very good ideas to get around those stumbling blocks, right? It takes coordination among states. It takes not relying on that one northern Italian factory for the one type of swabs that is now shut down, of course, because of COVID, severely limiting our ability to test. It takes creative ideas. It takes going well above and beyond what an academic economist would draw on a whiteboard as the ideal solution. It takes listening to those on the ground, actually doing the work, and it takes being creative, moving beyond Econ 101 into 102 and lots of other territories, and of course, taking the politics seriously. Political economy 101.
Thanks, Gernot. We're going to move now to Chris. Chris, thank you for coming back on board. I'm going to show my screen, so we'll work from my screen, and you can simply tell me when you want me to advance your slide.
Sure.
Chris, it's a pleasure to have you. Please go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks, Gernot. And I'm sorry I had those technical difficulties, but we're back online now. So the genesis of this webinar, Ruben, is that your mic? Maybe you could mute it. I think you got a fire alarm or something that's going off. So the genesis of this webinar was to think about what does the pandemic and our response to the pandemic present a unique opportunity for climate change? And if so, what is that opportunity? And what specifically should the BECC community do about that opportunity? And so, Ruben, you could go to the next slide here. This is a really complex topic, and there's lots of different dimensions that we could think about on this opportunity. So I thought I would do a quick kind of example of a SWOT analysis for us to think about this topic in all its different dimensions. So specifically, I'm posing for the United States here in this question, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of our particular response to climate change? And when we think about the kind of the strengths and weaknesses, you're really talking about essentially a cost-benefit analysis of our approach to addressing the pandemic. And when we're thinking about opportunities and threats, those are really forward, future thinking. And there's a lot less certainty. You're looking at kind of a risk assessment about the future. And so there's a lot that's been said about the benefits of our particular approach to climate change. Now, first of all, let's be clear why we are partially shutting down our economy, why we are social distancing, and why we've taken these really dramatic measures. Obviously, we're doing this to save millions of lives and to prevent our healthcare systems from being overrun. We all know this is very obvious, and many of people have brought up, okay, well, this is having an impact of shutting down our economy, slowing it down. We're slowing down greenhouse gas emissions. We're also reducing pollution, and there's been a number of images of pollution before and after the pandemic that have shown the clearing of air pollution in particular. And people have started to do this kind of cost-benefit analysis and thinking about the air quality benefits. That's saving lives. By one estimate, in China, just 1 month of shutting down or slowing down their economy saved 50,000 lives just in 1 month. And I think it's important to think about the greenhouse gas reductions in really the kind of the geological perspective. So we know there's going to be a short-term reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And if we can look back to the economic recession that took place in the 2008 to 2013 timeframe, in the United States, we experienced about a 5% reduction in GDP. And during that same time, we experienced about a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And by one study, about 3/4 of that total reduction was directly related to the slowdown in the economy. So we can expect kind of almost a 2-to-1 ratio of benefit to reducing greenhouse gas emissions for slowing down the economy. Of course, there are many other benefits we could talk about that in this particular kind kind of time frame. This is an opportunity for us to think about our relationship with the planet, spend more time at home. I have a garden that I've planted, call it my COVID garden. So this is a remarkable time in many respects for us. But of course, next slide, the costs are just astronomical of what we're experiencing. And I don't really need to go through this. We all know about the unemployment, poverty, people are losing their health care, increasing domestic violence. We're worried about people with depression, the social isolation, students not being able to get their education. Obviously, we're experiencing, just tremendous effects on the economy and its ramifications, increasing national debt. I do want to say something about long-term uncertainty here. So while the benefits for these secondary benefits for the climate may be kind of small in the short term, they could even be unfortunately greater, because the effects on the global economy could be much greater than we're experiencing or expecting to experience if we go into a deep economic recession, if it takes 1.5 years before we can get a vaccine and we have to keep shutting down the economy sporadically. Other countries in particular were worried about their healthcare systems being overrun. There's a nice story in the Atlantic that talks about kind of all the potential ramifications and that we could have, increased deaths from other areas, political violence, political turmoil, violence, etc. So, the costs to our economy, to society are really pretty dramatic. Okay, that's just a bit of the context. That's what we know. Okay, let's talk about what we don't know and what are some of the potential opportunities. When we think about the opportunities, go ahead, next slide, for the environment, really we're thinking about, okay, there could be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions going forward that could persist, and how can we ensure that we get the most attention to preventing this next crisis, which we are already starting to experience, which is potentially much, much larger than the crisis with the coronavirus, and that is climate change. Many people are drawing these parallels. But that outcome really requires or depends on these other dimensions. So PESTEL analysis looks at the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal dimensions that may be changing or in flux that may affect your particular outcome. So I wanted to kind of go over some of these that I think are really relevant. One is an opportunity on the political side is how is this going to affect our elections? It could affect either way. The Trump administration, Trump is now has a higher rating than he has in the past, and we know that while he's kind of has bungled, some of the response to climate change, his ratings are actually gone up. So is he going to be judged for that in November? I think is going to have a really strong effect on our policy and our ability to address climate change. Many people have talked about an increase in science-based decision-making, that scientists are the new heroes. So will people start listening to climate change scientists, and will that affect our ability to make change? There could be a response in that an increased role of the government, an increased recognition of the role of government, and that may lead to more social welfare programs, which has a kind of an indirect benefit on climate in that we may address equity better. I think one of the best opportunities for us, and I think the real opportunity in my view, if I were to pick one, is that we can focus the climate change messaging and focus our strategies on program implementation on more resiliency planning. And the reason why I think that's important is because both conservatives and liberals have a shared value system on, and in particular, this is really a conservative value, of being more self-reliant. So as households, as businesses, as communities, both being self-reliant and be preparing ourselves for natural disasters means having a renewable energy, having our homes and our businesses be more energy efficient, and producing and using all of our own energy locally. I think that's a message that we can really focus on that could meet all our mitigation goals while we're still preparing for making our communities more resilient. many people have thought about the opportunity really is economic, that this is an opportunity to have a green stimulus plan. And although that doesn't seem to be going very far, there's been a lot of calls for green stimulus. And we did see that in the response to the last recession. Unfortunately, we're not seeing this in the response to this current pandemic that, in fact, we'll get to that in a second, the stimulus has been, in fact, not green in many respects. We may find a more equitable distribution of resources in the future, in that we're starting to recognize that we are only as strong as our most vulnerable populations. And we're certainly experiencing that in a very, really real way with this pandemic and a response to the pandemic. Now, many people in the BECC community might want to talk about, behaviors that might change and might persist over time. So increased telecommuting, maybe people will be less likely to have travel long distances. We could talk about some of these behaviors that we're learning that may stick. People may like to work virtually, for example. I think there are also important psychological changes. We are now experiencing a catastrophe, and we understand and we feel collectively what that feels like. And so we maybe perhaps don't want that to happen in the future. But there also may be an increase in conservation values. So that is, we may want to kind of save our resources in the case that we kind of protect those for the future. Technological, I don't see a lot of changes here other than, like the virtual economy is kind of expanding, and perhaps more focus on an information economy, which is lower carbon. So those are some of the opportunities. I'm sure there are many, many other opportunities that we could think about. Let's look at some of the potential threats to addressing climate change. So perhaps greenhouse gas emissions will in fact increase, and there are many reasons why that could happen. Again, the November elections. We know that the Trump administration has been cutting regulation for vehicle standards, which is going to have long-term effects. They've been trying to get on that for a long time and have now their excuse to do that. Also regulating power plants, and well, basically environmental regulations are being cut. We're also seeing a shifting of priorities, whereas climate change may have been a bigger and more important strategy in the future, or perhaps energy efficiency and renewables and all the things that we're trying to accomplish. Those are kind of taking a back seat right now while we are, dealing with the pandemic. We could also see, of course, perhaps a dirty stimulus, and in that, well, if you think about it just in its kind of big picture, the $2 trillion is 10% of our economy. So just the stimulus alone is going to help buffer the effective economic recession, but it's also going to lead to emissions as people, of course, spend that money. And the question is, are we bailing out the right institutions? Are we bailing out the more carbon intensive sectors, for example? We also are experiencing low demand for oil, low oil prices as a result. And of course, that makes it much less attractive to buy an electric vehicle. And people, of course, have less money to spend right now on these technologies. So it's going to certainly maybe perhaps jeopardize or slow down some adoption of energy efficient and renewable energy technologies. We could also have, of course, a big rebound effect once we come out of the pandemic. Whenever that's going to happen, there's a lot of pent up demand for travel and for consumption. So, I put here like hedonism there as like a psychological change. We may have, some people may go the complete opposite way. They may come out of the pandemic and say, we just have to live life. Let's get out there and live it up and consume more and maybe even travel more, and while we can, because the life is uncertain. So while we're going to have some people on one end of the spectrum saying they're going to conserve, we might have the complete opposite on the other side. Technological, maybe people are going to demand more on-demand consumption, which can be more carbon intensive, having your packages delivered next day. I just want to say in closing a few things about these opportunities. First of all, you have to be very careful when doing any sort of cost-benefit analysis. When you start valuing people's lives in freaking economic terms, that can be very problematic. We must make sure that there are lots of trade-offs. Everybody's going to do these cost-benefit analysis differently, and we have to be careful about making those types of valuations. I think in my view, the biggest opportunity here, and the biggest challenge to fighting climate change, is we have a massive misallocation of resources to solve this problem. Climate change is, in my view, it's like we're in this relay race with climate change as our opponent to the death, essentially. And climate change is just like lapping us like 5 times before we can get around the track. And the problem is that we have all of our talent and our financial resources really spread out very, very wide and not always necessarily working on the problems in the most efficient way. So for the BECC community, I like to think about what really is the opportunity here? How can we more effectively channel our resources in those big levers that are going to make a lot of change? I'm proposing here that perhaps it has something to do with this change, maybe perhaps a focus on resiliency, focus on changing maybe our messaging strategies around being prepared for these great tragedies that we're starting to experience. Fires and flooding and tropical storms and crazy Arctic weather events, and we need to prepare for those because they are happening now. They're going to be increasingly happening in the future. So how can we make our societies more resilient? One proposal. I'd like to hear what other people have of their proposals. So that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was a very enlightening. Beth, do you want to introduce our next speaker?
I would love to. Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to turn it over from Chris to Ezzy Snell. Ezzy is Senior Manager and Lead Analyst at eSource. Ezzy helps lead the eSource Customer Energy Solutions Research Group, which focuses on emerging energy technologies, utility DSM program best practices, and strategic considerations around distributed energy resources. All of those words have so many syllables. He's published more than 300 reports, papers, and articles on such topics as utility decarbonization, innovative energy efficiency and load management technologies, the energy implications of Internet of Things, devices and systems, the evolving utility business model. And I can attest to Ezzy's subject matter expertise on all of the words in that paragraph that I understood, because he's one of the people that I go to when I have a question about energy and the relationship between energy and climate change. So thank you for joining us. I will turn it over to you, Ezzy. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. So we've heard 2 really great presentations so far on sort of the bigger picture impacts of climate change and coronavirus. And I'm going to focus more just on sort of the energy side. At eSource, we have gotten to talk with probably a few hundred at least utilities across the US and Canada just in the past weeks about how they're looking at COVID and coronavirus and climate change and how they're changing their goals as a result. So, before the whole COVID situation happened, what we've really been seeing over the past 3 years is a really big shift towards utilities adopting carbon-free or zero net carbon. Most of those are by 2050 at the latest. Some of them are sooner. Some of them are as soon as 2035. And so there's been this growing trend of utilities taking on these goals. And beyond just the utilities themselves, we're also seeing regional efforts to support emissions reductions that will also help drive additional utilities to adopt these types of goals. So obviously, climate change is one of the biggest reasons for prioritizing decarbonization, but a lot of the utilities that we've been following are actually looking at a number of different other areas kind of within that as to why they can justify decarbonization, why it's an important shift to make. One of the big ones has just been the rapidly changing economics of green energy. The Energy Information Administration came out with a projection recently that renewable energy is going to outpace generation from natural gas by next year, and coal in another 10 or so years. They've traditionally been very sort of conservative in their projections about renewables, and so that really points to how much the declining costs of green energy are really impacting things. We're also seeing a lot more customer demand, and that's really across all sectors. We did a study in collaboration with Claritas last year across about 32,000 customers in the US on the residential side. And we found that about 65% of them really want their utility to adopt more renewable energy. And similarly, on the commercial side, there's the growth of the RE100, which is a group of Fortune 500 companies primarily that have pledged to get 100% of their energy from renewable sources. And so there's these sorts of large sort of shifts in the market that are impacting utilities. Certainly risk reduction is another one, and that's both from a policy perspective in case at some point, there are carbon taxes or other sorts of local policies that will impact utilities. And there's also a broader risk that, companies that are associated with fossil fuels could potentially come to be seen as basically the big tobacco of our current age. And so wanting to get ahead of those types of risks and make sure that utilities are well positioned. Brand equity is another one, making sure that they're continuing to be able to serve their customers and be seen as an expert. And that's particularly true in more deregulated places where utilities have to compete with one another a little bit more. Certainly local legislative imperatives. Again, I mentioned all the cities that are adopting green energy goals. There are also revenue generation opportunities. And we've seen this with a lot of our electric utilities members in particular, where they're really excited about the prospect of potentially electrifying and achieving both carbon goals, but also helping them increase their revenue base. And then finally, there's a lot of new products and services that could potentially be supported through having a clear focus on decarbonization on the utility side. And just a few examples include things like smart home products and systems and services, community solar, weatherization. All of those have sort of a clearer focus and are an easier sell if you have a clear focus on decarbonization at the utility level. So the reason I bring all these up is that, certainly some of these may be fairly impacted by the current pandemic, but there are a lot of different reasons that utilities should be focusing on decarbonization and likely will going forward, even regardless of what happens in the coming weeks and months. I also just really quickly want to highlight the fact that different utilities are adopting different carbon goals. I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but the important thing to consider is that the way that utilities structure their goals at high level is really going to impact the way that they can try to pursue their goals going forward. So for example, if you're adopting a 100% renewable energy goal, that is really going to, your success in that is really going to depend on how you're defining renewable energy, and what sort of strategies you can enable with that. In contrast, something like a carbon neutral goal enables other options like carbon offsets, which may not necessarily be ideal from a climate standpoint in the long run, but it may give more flexibility for utilities in helping to meet their goals. And so the specific wording of these goals really does matter. And it's been something we've been kind of tracking and following. So when we've been talking with utilities about the impacts of COVID-19 on their existing energy efficiency, electrification, decarbonization programs, what we found is that a lot of them are taking sort of a wait and see approach. They're sort of proceeding with business as usual, and they're going to kind of continue to evaluate. There are a handful that are slowing down their progress towards their goals, but there are also a handful that are speeding up and actually trying to ramp up their focus on meeting their goals and using this as sort of a new, unique opportunity to help do that. One of the things that we think is especially important, though, is that utilities really make sure that they're keeping their vulnerable customers in mind and focusing on sort of an equitable solution. And that's true whether they're focusing on decarbonization, efficiency, anything else, particularly with the current COVID situation and so many people being negatively impacted, losing their jobs. It's going to be really important that utilities can work with their customers and really provide sort of an equitable solution that's going to help support them rather than having negative impact. And so these are a few of the specific types of things that we're seeing that utilities might be able to do in sort of the near, mid, and long term in the pandemic. Near term, things like focusing on low-income community solar to help lower rates while also promoting more renewables. Focusing on some low-hanging electrification measures. And some of the things that we've been looking at, beyond electric vehicles and building electrification are things like e-bikes, bus electrification. Those are some of the types of things that could be pretty easy to do right now for a lot of utilities as they're focusing on helping to do both building and transportation electrification. Also focusing on trade allies, doing virtual inspections rather than in-person ones, and really deepening customer engagement and becoming a partner for customers in a way that they may not necessarily have in the past. Midterm, looking more at shovel-ready programs that utilities can kind of put together now and have ready to go as opportunities present themselves. working with legislators, regulators, doing some workforce development and training for trade allies, things like that, and adding some new metrics to their strategic business plans. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then long-term, preparing for stimulus funding. And again, we don't really know what the stimulus efforts might look like going forward, but there may be some opportunities for utilities to really take advantage of that and help with decarbonization goals. And then finally, also partnering with states, cities, and counties around their focus on decarbonization as well. So one key strategy, and it's certainly not a silver bullet here, but beneficial electrification is going to be a really important thing for utilities and others to focus on. And so this is sort of a framework that we've been focusing on and sharing with our utility members, and we have a white paper on it if anyone's interested. But really kind of breaking it out into 3 different areas, looking at environmentally beneficial electrification, which is shifting away from fossil fuels to electric end uses, and so trying to drive down carbon emissions that way. Economically efficient electrification, so for example, if you can help people move from a fossil fuel-based appliance to an electric one that might actually save them money and cost less, that would be an example there. And grid efficient electrification, which is really about helping to make the grid more efficient, and so being able to drive down rates and sort of improve things on the utility side in that way. And so really the sort of ideal would be to find a lot of measures that are going to be in that sweet spot right in the middle where you can reduce carbon rates and bills all at the same time. But in many cases, it's hard to do that. And so a lot of electrification measures are really going to fall into some of these other overlapping areas. And so as we talk with utilities, one of the things we're discussing is, what really makes sense for them? What sort of measures should they focus on? How can they get as many of these benefits as possible while also promoting decarbonization too through these initiatives? And then again, for COVID-19, actually one more thing I'll say with electrification is just that, the current pandemic situation makes all of those types of benefits even more important to focus on. Because especially as utilities are looking at how they respond and help out with the local communities, how they respond to their customers and support them in these times, the more of these benefits they can hit, the better positioned they'll be able to be to respond effectively going forward. And then, as I mentioned before, we think there are a lot of opportunities for utilities to really adjust some of the metrics they're using in their business case justifications, given the COVID situation. And so those metrics could include things like job creation and security, air quality. There's been several reports coming out recently that show that poor air quality is associated with higher fatality rates for COVID-19. And so that could be one area, particularly now, to focus on for utilities. Obviously, reducing touch points and in-person contact. And that's true with customers and trade allies and all those different folks that utilities work with. Food security and access, equity, and really focusing on sort of supply chain impacts. We don't really know exactly what impacts the supply chain might have in the long term, but that's something that could potentially affect a lot of utility programs, DSM and decarbonization. And then also just really being focused on local communities, spending money locally, helping local small and mid-sized business customers. Again, being a partner in this difficult situation. Those are all some really big opportunities right now. And then I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think, as Chris mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty about what potential stimulus funding may look like going forward. These are some examples that we saw with ARA in 2010 around things like job creation, obviously, increasing distributed energy resources, focusing on energy innovation and grid modernization. And although, given the current political environment, we may not see as much of a focus on renewable energy and things like that. Certainly, there could be focuses on updating our grid, helping to do more construction projects, which utilities could work with around, decarbonization, electrification types of efforts, and those types of things. And so we do expect that there will be a lot of different opportunities for utilities going forward with this. So finally, I want to mention for any utility members that are on the line, we've actually, or any utilities, we put together an online resource center which compiles a lot of different research we're doing right now on the current pandemic. You don't have to be an eSource member, but you do have to be a utility in order to access it. And so definitely check that out. We're trying to figure this out along with everyone else and figure out the best ways to continue to promote efficiency, DSM, and decarbonization going forward through this pandemic. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again, and I'll turn it back to Beth.
Beth, we can't hear you.
Well, that's because I hadn't unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
You're a very good mime, I have to say.
Okay. So thanks, Ezzy. Thanks, everyone. I'm reminded of that old joke. How many climate scientists does it take to fill up an hour? And the answer is less than you'd think. We're almost at the hour. We knew that was going to happen in advance. We have made this webinar an hour and 15. We still will be limited. We probably will go a little bit over. So just so you know, those of you who have been to a lot of these, we made this one a little bit longer. So we hope you can stay with us, because we always sign off for the Q&A, and that's often the richest discussion. I started with this. This has been going around, never let a good crisis go to waste, and I was curious who first said it. I'd seen it attributed to Rahm Emanuel, Hillary Clinton. It was actually Winston Churchill, and this is what I think a lot of us are thinking about, right? This is awful, and this is an opportunity, as all crises often are. And we've heard these. I would say my talk, if I were to name it now, would be what Chris said with photos. So I'll try not to belabor too many points that he so eloquently made. We're seeing these climate impacts, and a lot of the conversation is focused on this as the opportunity of COVID. I'm not sure, this is a photo of Delhi, which I think Gernot and Chris both mentioned, some of the stark differences we're seeing in air quality, but I'm not sure if this is the right narrative, if this is COVID's great lesson to climate change, to coronavirus, to climate change, for a couple reasons. One is, as has been mentioned, it's not permanent, and two, it might push, and we might be leaning into a narrative that we don't want to be leaning into, which is pitting economy versus environment. Sure, we could do something if everybody stayed at home. That might not be a long-term message. So what is, if this is part of, but not all of the opportunity and not where we want to focus, where do we? And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I love all the phrases that have been coming out as somebody who studies communication. The great pause. These immediate climate impacts are important for us to see what happens when we pause. And there's a lot more that happens when we pause. Pauses psychologically give us the greatest opportunity to change. Habit change is very difficult. Habit change is most possible during times of transition. So during this great pause is a moment where we can look at the immediate changes and also understand that they're not permanent, but we do have an opportunity to lock in more permanent and consistent changes. So that's where I've been thinking during this great pause, what can go not back to normal? Because some things we want to go back to normal. I want to hug people again, probably 100 people on this webinar. I know very well and would love to hug again. Another 800 I haven't met, and I'd love to hug you. Some things we don't want to go back to normal. There's some things we were doing before this started that we don't have to go back to. So first, one thing we've realized is that change is possible. And this webinar is part of the Behavior Energy Climate Change Conference. Behavior change is possible. Let's just look at behavior. I don't think anyone, and there's research already suggesting, no one's ever gonna wash their hands the same way. We're spending more time, and I put a pro tip to the right. Anyone who has an echo, I would just say whatever your wake word is. If you haven't done this, I'm washing my hands. I have to be careful because I have 3 in my home. You'll get a cute little 20-minute song that the folks at Amazon brought to us. We can love them, we can hate them, but they write cute jingles. So we see that there are permanent changes to behavior. So what does that mean? What for climate, right? What can we change? There's a lot of things. Again, Chris talked about them, Ezzy talked about them, Gernot talked about them, our telecommuting, our work behaviors, our work travel, the way we travel when we are even traveling, where we're shopping, how we're supporting local economies, volunteerism, how we're supporting each other as communities, what we're doing with our energy portfolios. Maybe we want to become more resilient, alone and able to be independent, and together, using technology to both limit or attenuate our emissions and also connect us. And then how can we change behaviors? I think there are a couple really, several really interesting lessons, and I can only talk about a couple. As many of you know, I didn't introduce myself, did I? As many of you know, and many of you don't, I'm a research psychologist by training. So I study behavioral science, and I specifically went back to graduate school to study behavioral science for the purposes of attenuating anthropogenic climate change. And I've been very involved in a lot of different efforts, but maybe because I live in Los Angeles, I've gravitated towards media and towards solution-focused information and communication technology. And oh boy, golly, have we seen a lot of successes in viral short video, in compelling longer narratives, in infographics. The New York Times infographics have been amazing in engaging us. So we can think about that. That's a tool that we use, but I don't know if we've used it as well as we could in the climate and energy space. One way we can change is by trying to make tragedy as fun as possible. I worked with an organization for a number of years focused on genocide called Invisible Children, and they said, stop at nothing, celebrate everything. We can have joy without being disrespectful towards the seriousness of what's going on. We can wear our face masks with oink on them, or lips, or beards, or what have you. We can bring joy into and bring levity into what is a dark situation. And just like coronavirus, climate change, if we don't act, is bleak. And we've seen the power of social norms that is talked about a lot in the BECC community, but really half the time when I'm personally thinking about decisions, I'm thinking about my risk, and then I'm thinking about the message it sends. And what would my community think of me, and what am I putting out there into my community? Even if I think I might be safe if I keep my distance, I know that I'm setting a precedent, and that's really been locked into us. How can we take this? I think there are some real great precedents in what community means and what behavior means that we can build upon coming out of this pause. And then looking at language, terms like social distancing, alone together, and flatten the curve emerged in a moment. So there's something for us to think about. What's our social distance? What language? We did see that a big shift from calling what we're talking about global warming to climate change. Have we gotten it right yet? Chris mentioned resilience. I've been thinking a lot about resilience framing. Also in science we trust, there's been an increased trust and reliance, it seems like, at least in large communities, in science. Maybe shifting from a focus on just, and I know this is very controversial, ecosystems to the humans, right? I think the health climate links have become much more clear. The social justice and environmental justice links are becoming much more clear. So there's a lot of strings, I think, when it comes to language and framing that we can pull on. And we actually have time that coronavirus didn't have. We have time to test, to play with some of this language, to start figuring out how we want to be messaging. So when the acute phase and we move into the new not normal of our lives, that we might be able to have some insights by then. And then looking forward, we know that there's a good chance that we're going to see more things, more potentially mass pandemics, as well as other natural disasters. And what's going to happen when the next, if and when we have the next fire or the next flood. I actually had a great conversation with a close colleague who I saw is on this call, and we were back channeling, has agreed to speak very informally, not in her professional role. So I'm wondering if Elaine, you would be willing to join us and share, because most of my thoughts on this slide came from my conversations with Elaine, and she said she might be able to speak to us directly.
Hi, Beth. Yeah, this is Elaine, and I just want to start by thanking you for inviting me to say a few words. Second, I want to put out there that all the views that I'm about to express are entirely my own, and they don't represent the position of anyone in the U.S. government. So just want to put that out there. So yeah, there's basically three big opportunities that I see here, and things that I'm hoping that this COVID situation will help us to further our conversation on, but that I think are really important for this community as we think about the work that we do, especially as evaluators. And this is a conversation that I've probably been having for well over a year, maybe even longer. But there are three big opportunities that I'd like to point out that are related to climate, but that again are highlighted by what we're currently experiencing. And those are around resilience and disaster planning, around the way that we invest in infrastructure, and in the way that we provide assistance. So these are all things that we've already decided to do, potentially money that we're already going to be spending. But as we've seen, when we're looking at clean energy technologies in particular, whether it's things like solar, community solar, battery storage technologies, electric vehicles, all the things that were mentioned by so many of the prior panelists, beneficial electrification, what we see is that there's been this convergence of things that are happening. We've got all these new technological capabilities that are out there. We've got rapidly declining costs for all of these technologies. And then we've got basically this whole new conversation about vulnerability that has been brought about by a whole series of disasters, whether it's the hurricanes in Puerto Rico or the fires in California, or this, where we really start to understand what vulnerability looks like. And so there are a few things that I've seen at a high level that have to do not just with federal programming, but also state level planning, where there's a misalignment of the way that we want to move these conversations forward and to be able to really take advantage of that convergence, especially again, when you look at some of the policy drivers with 100% renewable energy standards and things like that. And so the first is that in the disaster and resilience planning space, in 2018, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was passed to change the Stafford Act. And that changes how FEMA and HUD use their disaster dollars. It basically says that instead of just replacing like for like, we can build something more resilient going forward. However, there's no guidance for how to do that. So the task forces to put together that kind of guidance, those haven't really been formed. And the way that those dollars get spent are based on plans that happen at the state level. And right now, states are not putting together mitigation type plans. That's the other thing. FEMA now has the ability to spend money on mitigation. So we're talking about potentially hundreds of millions to billions of dollars every year that will be deployed to deal with disasters, to deal with mitigation for potential disaster. But these dollars do not have, they don't have an alignment. That planning hasn't happened to align with these longer term goals around the climate or all of these other kinds of social benefits that we want to see happen. So that's one area where cities and states can do a better job by thinking about planning ahead and doing mitigation measures and being prepared in the event that disaster funding comes their way. The second opportunity comes in looking just at how we are deploying our everyday energy assistance programs. I look at programs like the WAP program, Weatherization Assistance Program, and that's a program that does invest in permanently reducing the cost of energy. But when I look at programs like LIHEAP, we're basically looking at number of households served. And so that's an action kind of a metric. It's not a outcome-based metric. And even when you look at weatherization assistance programs, energy savings can't be the only metric that we're looking at. Cost savings, reducing energy burden, those can be better metrics. But again, if you want to do anything that has to do with fuel switching or electrification, you want to be able to use carbon metrics as well. And so we need to have new and better evaluation that we can bring in. And we also want to be looking at a much wider range of benefits, again, around social kinds of benefits, whether it's jobs or health benefits, environmental benefits. And right now, those are not baked into the program. And ultimately, again, when you look at some of the technologies that are out there and the capabilities that are out there, they have new business models. Community solar business models are very different than what you would be looking at with a standard weatherization program. And so instead of having folks have to apply in to get some kind of a waiver to be able to do those things as though they're special, there needs to be a shift toward making it really clear that those kinds of technologies, capabilities, business models, and metrics are explicitly things that have eligibility for all of those programs. We're talking about $10 billion a year that's being spent every year by HUD, by LIHEAP. There's even more through the low-income housing tax credit. And so if we want to be integrating into these systems that have to do with infrastructure, with housing, with poverty, and with finance, we need new metrics there. And then the third, and one of the biggest, easiest things that we could do to better align would be to have the US put together a central development bank. Europe has a central development bank. There are other development banks for other countries. I know that the US is a developed nation, but right now the average American can't invest in the well-being and, again, positive social outcomes for the rest of society. And one way to help better align people with seeing those kinds of positive outcomes is to align their finances with it and to give them the opportunity to invest in the success, the resilience, and the well-being of their communities. So those are three big opportunities I see in better aligning our resilience planning, better aligning our existing assistance programs, and in better aligning our own personal finance with well-being for folks. And again, doing better evaluation, including more metrics that acknowledge that we have fantastic new solutions and capabilities and new business models to address
it. Try unmuting yourself, Beth.
I guess I want to be seen and not heard. That is really not my normal MO. Thank you, Ruben. So we're going to bring everyone back together. I am like gobsmacked. I have so many thoughts in my head. And we have so many experts. This is just who we could fit in our first webinar. This is the beginning of our conversation. I think one thing we heard from a lot of people, and if I can say one last thing in this great pause, we have this opportunity to be capacity building. We have this opportunity right now and after. That's, I think, what BECC offers, the opportunity to learn together, teach, support, develop. Let's think about, what do you have to learn in this moment? What do you have to offer in this moment? And so I will not end with another poem, but that's what BECC gives us. And while we have everyone else, is everyone back on? All right, we have everyone back on. I'm going to turn over to Maxine to walk us through some questions. Again, we'll keep going. We were scheduled to 1/4 Those of us who can stay on will stay on for a bit longer, probably until 1/2 and then we'll try to get to other questions and let us know how we can move this forward into the Behavior, Energy, Climate Change Conference. Will we be virtual, in person? How are we thinking about these things? So we'll go to questions, but please know that this is the beginning of our BECC conversation about this. It's not a one-time webinar discussion, as we all know. And thank you to our speakers. If I don't say that, if I forget to say that again at the end, I'm, again, wonderful, so grateful for all of your time and everyone who's joining us. All right, Maxine.
Maxine, you have some questions for us?
Yes, I do. So actually, here's a question for you, Beth, and then I'll actually tie it into another related question. So this person asks, are we better off targeting behavior change at the local level, so dealing with cities and states, or targeting countries and like, country behavior? And then just to tie in another question, how is this going to be a problem given that currently governments are not able to agree on a policy for shelter in place?
Yeah. Oh, and I just realized, because I put our faces up, is everyone seeing just the BECC slide, or is everyone seeing our faces twice?
People are seeing the BECC slide, and your faces are webcams.
Okay, good. I just put our faces in front of it, and I didn't know how it was working. Sorry. So good question. I'll answer briefly and then see if others have thoughts. Should we be focusing at the local or national level or international? And my answer is yes. I think one thing we're seeing from this is and I think one of the big areas we have potential to explore is individual, local, national, international. I've been thinking a lot about this alone together, that we need to be thinking about resilience, both as individual households, cities, and states, as well as together as nations and the globe. And we need to not think of that in kind of a dichotomy, but more in a dialectic. Those are not opposites. We need to be thinking about local, household level, city level resilience, state level, and global. And if we pit those against each other, we're going to stay in the place that we're in. And I'm going to see if anyone, did I miss, I was so excited about the first question, I might have missed the second half.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the second half was basically asking the question about how governments are kind of struggling to agree on what to do right now. And so would that approach work?
And I think that's part of it. If we think about this both and, right? I was taught in some earlier life process work that if we think about relationships, we can think about this in governments as 50-50, and we want to meet in the middle. The second there's any gap, there's a failure, right? But if you have parties and both take full responsibility over something, I am fully responsible for my relationship with you and you're fully responsible, or I'm fully responsible for Earth and so are you. If there's a gap, as there always will be because we're not perfect, we're covered, right? We've got a net. So if we think about it that way, I think it's this meeting. It's like I'm doing this and you're doing this. We're going to keep having that gap. But if we kind of think about full resilience at the local level and full care underneath it, a full net, then even when we're imperfect, we'll have so much room underneath us. And I'll see if other speakers have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I've had so much experience with folks at the federal, state, and local level, and ultimately, you know, it's like two heads are better than one, millions of heads are better than one. Cities, states are constantly folks who are coming up with amazing solutions, forwarding them, and those are where we learn from one another, learn how to do something new and better. Again, demonstrate that these solutions work in a way that they can then get taken up at larger and larger scale. It's incredibly important to have that innovation at the state and local level if you want to be able to show and get momentum to have more of that national level activity, move forward. So I think it's incredibly important to do both. And of course, if you have, we often hope when federal policy, national policy is being made, that they leave the room so that those kinds of more local innovations can happen as well.
Maxine?
Oh, no other thoughts. Okay. I think this question is directed to Essie. Do you think this crisis could increase the appetite for restructuring or perhaps even decentralizing utilities and energy markets?
That's a really great question. I don't know. I think it's pretty early to say one way or another. And I think it depends a lot on how utilities respond to this crisis. One of the things that we've been focusing on a lot over the past however many years has been on trying to help utilities become more partners with their customers and see them less as just peers, but actually, customers that are important to serve. And I think if they use this opportunity to really push that further and, develop these relationships with their customers and help support them in this difficult time, then they may be able to avoid some of the risks of, sort of structural changes. On the other hand, if they don't respond well, then those types of restructurings may potentially be on the table, but it's hard to know at this point.
We're actually we're going to be doing some research looking at that in California, specifically in the context of CCA, community choice aggregation, whether post-COVID people are thinking differently about local and city versus corporate provision of energy. So I'll hopefully have more on that next year, maybe this year, probably next year at BECC.
Okay, and another question here. Would you say COVID-19 is a wake-up call to restructure political economy in terms of what we consume, how we consume, and how much we consume?
That feels like it might, well, for anyone but Gernot, that might be a good question for you to take a stab at if you're interested.
Yes and no, right? So on the one hand, sure, it is. It ought to be, must be. On the other hand, if this is what it feels like, no, thank you. I like my consumption right about now, right? The one I can't be doing. No, I'm not. I don't miss the 90-minute transfer at Chicago O'Hare for a meeting that only lasts 45 minutes somewhere else. We better be continuing that via video conference afterwards. Lots of behavior that ought to change permanently. And consumption will go down, will change as a result. Right? That said, what was the statistic yesterday? Retail decreased 10%, 9% last month, and we only partially shut down that month. Right? This month, it'll go down by even more. And by the way, so 9% or whatever the stat was is actually sort of a fairly low number. I would have expected it to be much higher. Is that a good thing? Well, yeah, okay, we are using fewer resources. Well, mental health professionals are pretty busy right now as a result, not because we missed our quick shopping fix, but, well, because we're all stuck at home, right? Just, personal example, it was a pretty good idea to share 800 square feet in the middle of everything at center in New York City here. Third floor walk up. Yep, here we go. So that was a fantastic idea while we were able to use everything. Yeah, here's the Lego right here on the floor next to me, right? Right, will we all be moving into bigger houses as a result? If we are forced to be stuck, I hope not. I won't be moving anytime soon. Well, one of the reactions, frankly, right, so very, very direct behavioral response, if we no longer have to commute into work on a regular basis because we've all figured out that working from home is actually better, well, homes will get bigger as a result. Even further away from the cities, right? Will that mean suburbs are suddenly growing again, even though we all know we should be moving into smaller apartments in the city and biking more and so on and so forth? Who knows? It could certainly go both ways.
I'd like to add something to that. Yeah, I of course agree. And I think we need to think about, when we're looking at consumption and behavior, have the motivations for consumption changed? And have the barriers preventing us from changing our consumption changed? And I think for the most part, those motivations haven't perhaps changed so much, and the barriers, when they are lifted after the pandemic ends, right now we have a lot of barriers preventing us from consuming. When that no longer is in place, what are we left with? And so we're kind of like talking about on the margin what we expect to change, and of course it's all uncertain at this point. But yeah, what can we do to promote the types of changes that we want? I guess is one of the important questions.
I think, on the energy side in particular, we're seeing a lot of increased consumption, of course, on the residential side, with everyone working from home. And so that could also present a number of opportunities to help improve efficiency and reduce bills and roll out new refreshers and all that stuff too. So that's just one small facet.
Okay, we have a question about transportation. So, given that it is a major contributor of GHG emissions and that working remotely is, likely going to become a more long-term practice, what does that mean for office spaces? And also, will rent-shared office spaces, that'll be used on an as-needed basis be more common?
So I can jump in with another non-answer because I love those. We get to figure that out. I think we don't know, right? And I'll invite other speakers to kind of predict. I think that's exciting. I think we have no idea. I think we get to create the future together. We're not sure how many people there's. It already looks like some very early research that companies are more open to telecommuting. We're probably going to see more 3-2, probably not 100% telecommuting. People will probably go back to work, many. There will probably still be meetings and less. And what does that mean? I know an organization I've worked with, Global Fund for Women, about a decade ago, downsized their offices and no one has a personal desk. They have enough desk space and they're beautiful desks and computers. There's some with full computers, some with just plug-in screens. There's stations for about 60 to I think 70% of their workforce. So that, and then they have teams, have days they come in and everyone's welcome to come in, but they also are welcome to work from home. And so that they might be a model. I would love for people to be, anyone who's local in the Bay Area, to visit Global Fund, look at what they're doing. Let's figure out who those models are. There are already leaders. Let's learn from them. And then let's be a part of that change as a community. We're behavioral people, researchers and implementers and other actors in this space. Let's figure out how we can identify champions and help train and educate and scale solutions that we think will be in the benefit of the climate. And I'll just say what I'm excited about is not knowing and then figuring out who's doing cool stuff and working with them to scale it.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is that the demand for mobility perhaps will decrease. I think generally the demand is still there for people to get around. And transportation is a very carbon intensive sector. That's why we see those bigger decreases in emissions when the economy goes down. But how much of that will experience is really interesting open question.
Yep. And then there's a big difference between, right, commuting and travel. Commuting may well go down, right? We'll be working from home more. Well, now that I can work from anywhere, okay, Bali or a bus, right? So I'll spend the month of January in Thailand, right? Why not? That's working from home too, right? That's one of the bigger questions, and frankly, of course, right? Carbon intensive airplane travel is one of the biggest questions of them all, in terms of like long distance travel and trying to figure out how to frankly guide norms, behavior in a big way that goes well beyond sort of the simple policy quick fix.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through some of these questions. So we have another kind of utility related question here. A group of large energy users known as, in New York, known as the Multiple Interveners, has petitioned the Public Service Commission to suspend collections that fund the state and utility clean energy programs. Has this occurred in other states, and what has the response been?
I'm actually not as familiar with everything that's going on in other states at the moment. I'd be happy to follow up with whoever asked the question. We can get into a little bit more, but that's not something I've looked at as much. I expect that this will be an ongoing discussion in a lot of different regions about, what is the best use of funds and revenues that utilities are collecting, but I haven't seen a whole lot yet on exactly how that's playing out.
I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions, one or two, depending on how long they are.
Okay, I think you could all take a stab at this. How could individuals get their governments and institutions to create changes that are needed to help with the climate crisis at this time?
Vote. Go vote.
Yeah, I think that's one. I've done a little bit of work, and I try and think about this in all of my work into social movements. And we talk about top down and bottom up, but really what we need, and what we've seen in COVID as an example, is enough behavior. If you're familiar with diffusion of innovation, Everett Rogers, we need enough behavior that it provides political cover, that it enables electeds to act, and then we need to support those electeds to act. So you need to act in advance of the laws, of regulations, of guidelines, so that your electeds feel comfortable putting forth guidelines, regulations, and then when those show up, you need to support them. So it's kind of a both and. We need to act early, then vote and support regulation that's in accordance with what we want to see ourselves and other people doing.
I'd like to add a bit of a plug for education and for youth. I think generally the education system that we have has trained people to be very marginal. to very kind of fit into the existing system and provide kind of a marginal change in that system. And I've long said, you know, if you're not doing your job better than the next person, then you're not even helping. So we need to find a way to train students. Data science is a really good example. Train them in a field where you can provide a lot of benefit, leverage your skills and your talent to identify where you can make the biggest impact. And, you know, it could be through organizing, it could be through science, it could be through, you know, leveraging, figure out where those leverage points are and focus on that. We need to change the system in a big way. I mean, policy clearly is going to be one of the biggest ways in which we can change policy. So get good information to policymakers to make those right decisions, figure out where your biggest impact is going to be. Go find those billionaires to invest in the things that you think are important, and try to think about not just making, you know, more impact, but 10 times more impact, 100 times more impact, 1,000 times more impact. It is possible to do if we really channel our resources effectively.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you again to all the presenters. You can see my face, and that means that our time is up, unfortunately. But it's been a fantastic webinar, and I know we have lots of questions that we didn't get to. If you are one of those people that asked one of those questions, have no fear, because we will be sending the questions along to all our presenters. And I'm not sure if you can still see my screen, but things are going a little wonky over here at ACEEE. I just want to remind you again that if you're interested in this kind of research, tune in again to our next webinar on May 20th. You can register now at becconference.org. And of course, we hope to see you all in December, hopefully under healthier conditions. You guys are all great. This has been a fantastic webinar, and we'll see you again on May 20th.